Hola, tenemos en este día el placer de poder iniciar un nuevo ciclo de conversaciones en un formato distinto del que veníamos teniendo en estos encuentros para pensar futuros posibles. En este caso es una charla más íntima, más de puesta en foco de algunas cuestiones y en particular en este primer encuentro con Gabriel Rockhill, con quien estamos muy contentos de poder conversar en este día. Leandro Martínez de Petri es uno de los miembros del equipo curatorial de BIENALSUR y quien nos ha introducido a Gabriel y a la posibilidad y al interés y la posibilidad de pensar juntos. Y como BIENALSUR es un proyecto que suma voces, que piensa con otros y que le interesa hacer circular la palabra, para nosotros es especialmente interesante poder expandir este diálogo a este momento y a este contexto actual. Quizás ya sepas, Gabriel, que nosotros veníamos trabajando con un formato de encuentros desde que comenzó BIENALSUR en 2015, bajo el paraguas conceptual de Sur Global. Los encuentros Sur Global dieron vida a numerosos intercambios, diálogos entre distintos actores de la escena artística internacional, buscando encontrar distintas vías para pensar el presente. Cuando comenzó este complejo 2020 y en particular cuando este lockdown casi global o imaginariamente global, quizás deberíamos decir, nos dejó a todos en la casa, empezamos a cuestionarnos cómo seguir y encontramos un nuevo leitmotiv que es el de pensar futuros posibles. Estos encuentros comenzaron en mayo y la voz circuló a través de distintos problemas. Primero fue una especie de estado de la cuestión o estado de situación. Luego fuimos avanzando sobre cómo este presente iba construyendo narrativas y a la vez cómo iban apareciendo imágenes de este presente o cómo se iba prefigurando este presente en imágenes. Trabajamos con algunos proyectos, retomamos algunas buenas prácticas que nos parecía interesante que tuvieran continuidad, a la vez que revisamos críticamente cómo llegamos hasta aquí. Y en ese sentido, y para darte ya la voz, nos interesaba especialmente en esta conversación contigo poner como en contexto una situación historiográfica que creo que es un debate en donde se inscribe tu pensamiento. Si en el 68 la urgencia del presente y las revisiones llevaron a quererlo todo y quererlo ya, y a ese lema que marcaba una intervención en el presente muy fuerte, hoy, 2020, asistimos a un nivel de incerteza que nos llevó a creer que el tiempo estaba suspendido. Entre esos dos parámetros, en los 60, el alumbramiento de esta historia del tiempo presente, y el 17, cuando tú publicaste una contrahistoria del tiempo presente, se marca un rango de reflexión que me parece que sería interesante que comentaras. Y a la vez, cómo esto repiensa este presente actual, en donde el presente apareció como suspendido y a su vez esta posibilidad de pensar futuros está plagada de incertezas.
Thank you so much for the question. It's a pleasure to be here and discuss these ideas with the two of you. I would say that one starting point for interrogating the present is to understand the ways in which counter history, as I've tried to theorize it, but of course drawing on the work of many others, does two things at once. On the one hand, it contests the dominant historical imaginary. And by that, I mean the way in which there's a kind of common sense understanding of history that has been accepted by many, but also imposed by very powerful propaganda and the kind of information apparatus that the globe is subjected to. And that dominant imaginary is intent on convincing all of us that we're somehow at the end of history and that there's no alternative to the socioeconomic system that we're living in, and that there are forces that are beyond our control, and that at best what we can do is be spectators in watching these processes unfold. And so I've unpacked in that regard the ways in which a lot of the dominant historical imaginary of the neoliberal conjuncture actually redeploys a lot of vulgar historiography. It's reductivist, it's determinist, it's also teleological, and it attempts to convince us that history is inevitable and we can only follow its consequences. But the second aspect of counterhistory, I think, maybe speaks more directly to the question that you just raised, and that is that counterhistory is an attempt as well to methodologically transform our tools of historical understanding so that we can have a different apprehension of the contemporary world order. And I'll just take one very specific example of that. Usually when people do histories of the present, they focus on the kind of chronological dimension of history, and they look at what's happening now in a particular place and time, and, or I'm sorry, a particular location or particular space, and then they tend to universalize that or generalize it. And one of the most standard models is you look at what's going on in Europe and the United States, and then you have a kind of diffusionist historiography where you assume it's the same case elsewhere. Against that, counterhistory, as I've conceptualized it, really insists on the geographic dimension of history, right? So that there's not a present that's shared by all people around the globe, particularly at a moment in time at which you only have 52% of the world's population that has regular access to internet, right? So we shouldn't assume that all people are online right now. In fact, there are many people who just don't have access to online technologies. And the other dimension of history that I insist on in counterhistory is the stratigraphic dimension, right? So in each place and time, there's social stratification, there's class struggle, there's socioeconomic polarization that makes it such that the lives of poor people, for instance, in a location like Buenos Aires or where I am in Philadelphia, they live the present moment in a very different way than other people live it. And so counterhistory attempts to give us methodological tools by which we can map the multidimensional aspects of the present by looking at how the historical dimension, the geographic dimension, and the stratigraphic dimension, when we pay attention to them and materially map them, give us a very different apprehension of what's going on. And it really forecloses the possibility of saying things like, well, in the present moment, we have a globalized society in which everyone is connected and communicating in new ways, and the future is bright because the technology can solve all of our problems and other such things. And so in that regard, there's both the counterhistory provides a critique of the content of the dominant historical imaginary, but also the form and the methods that are used to structure the dominant historical narratives.
Es bien interesante esto y no puedo evitar pensar en lo que es uno de los temas sobre los que trabajo en términos de dimensión histórica, que es la modernidad. Quienes trabajamos desde Latinoamérica y con casos latinoamericanos, siempre encontramos justamente un problema respecto a este gran relato, estas narrativas modernas y las contemporáneas, por supuesto, también, que tienden a homogeneizar una percepción de tiempo y una experiencia de lo contemporáneo, dejando de lado todas las diversidades, ¿no? Y por lo tanto, si hay un reloj que es el que marca el tiempo presente, los demás están atrasados y punto, en el mejor de los casos. En el mejor de los casos digo que se reconozca una diferencia de tiempo, y si no, directamente no entran en esa foto del presente. Ese es un problema complejo que quienes trabajamos sobre la historia y el arte, digamos, en particular de las visualidades en América Latina, nos enfrentamos. De allí también me parece el interés de poder incorporar esta perspectiva que estás planteando, no solo para intervenir en este presente, sino para encontrar en las dimensiones históricas esta pluralidad y estos matices que dan las diferencias de posicionamiento social, económico, geográfico, cultural, etcétera, ¿no? Me parece bien interesante. No, pensé que tenías un comentario.
No, que digo, en ese sentido, bueno, Gabriel dirige con Jennifer Ponce de León una línea editorial que presta atención a autores de distintas partes del mundo, ¿no, Gabriel? Lo cual traduce al inglés a autores de distintas partes del mundo, lo cual considerando un dato como que, por ejemplo, si no recuerdo mal esto, creo que solo un 3% de los libros que se editan en Estados Unidos son originalmente en otro idioma que no es inglés. Y en ese sentido, hablando de la modernidad, como decías vos, Diana, me parece súper interesante, Gabriel, preguntarte por tu interés reciente en la figura de José Carlos Mariátegui, ¿no? Hablando de importantes
Claro.
figuras de la modernidad latinoamericana.
Sí, solo acotar una cosa a lo que acaba de comentar Leandro, que tiene que ver también con la circulación de saberes, ¿no? O sea, el problema de la traducción también ataca justamente a la cuestión de la circulación de saberes y cómo lo que no está en inglés muchas veces no circula y muchas veces el sistema de readers, por ejemplo, algo a lo que es muy afecto a la universidad norteamericana, termina como condensando como saber único eso a lo que se tiene acceso porque está en inglés, cuando hay una producción profusa en francés o en español que podría enriquecer ciertas discusiones, ¿no? Y el caso de Mariátegui me parece que es súper interesante.
Yeah, thank you. I would say two things. The first is that it's absolutely the case that the dominant political imaginary and historical imaginary that I was referring to earlier comes directly out of the deep history of colonialism and what's called the civilizing mission, right? The idea that Europe is the most developed country and that other countries are backwards and that it can come and share its technological advancements, its culture, and other such things. And one of the trajectories that I've been interested in is how the civilizing mission has been transformed into a kind of democratico-technical mission in which the basic logic is the same, right? It's Europe and the United States that are at the cutting edge of development technologically and purportedly democratically, and I would put big scare quotes around that, as I'm sure most of you know why. And that type of colonial history is alive and well and just functioning in under a slightly different guise. In relationship to that, then to speak more pointedly to Leandro's question, the global theory industry functions largely by taking its marching orders from some of this colonial logic. So the authors who tend to be translated from Latin America or elsewhere around the world are the authors who are producing work that tends to coalesce with the needs and interests of the global theory industry as it's been developed out of the Euro-American world, right? So there's been numbers of studies that have been done on decolonial theory, on anti-colonial struggles, and other such things, and that look at how what is translated into English tends to be the most palatable political arguments for the liberal intelligentsia in the global north, and that a lot of the traditions, if it be in Latin America or elsewhere, that actually contest things like the democratico-technical mission that I was just referring to, that call into question US empire and imperialism, that criticize capitalism, these types of work tend to be rendered secondary, not translated. There aren't conferences organized around their work and other such things. Mariátegui would be an excellent example of it. Ticio Escobar would be a great example. Juana Cha. And there's a lot of very important theory that is emanating out of the global South, but has not become a major reference point that's translated, discussed, and debated. And what's important, I think, for people like us to recognize is that this is part of a material struggle within institutions of power that has very powerful political implications because it creates an image of the world in which Latin American theory is either backwards or old school or undeveloped, or it's transformed only into a very palatable form of quote unquote Latin American theory, which is the theory that's taken up within the US imperial institutions. And so we really have to be vigilant about how sites of cultural and intellectual production continue to carry forth various colonial projects.
No, pienso que es un enlace súper interesante ya además que planteamos las preguntas por la historia y centrada en el arte, no solo en la literatura, sino también en lo que hace tus investigaciones sobre la construcción del canon desde el norte, ¿no? Y lo que fueron tus investigaciones sobre la relación entre los relatos museográficos en Estados Unidos y la influencia de las agencias de inteligencia en la Guerra Fría, que es un tema que creo que queríamos tocar también. Quizás querés contarnos un poco de eso en relación.
Yes, when I first got into this research, I was a bit worried that I was going to become the CIA guy, you know, the intellectual who's just convinced that there are deep state elements that are structuring and manipulating everything. But as I dug through the archive, I became increasingly aware of the fact that so many people pay attention to political theater and to the surface phenomena of the art and cultural world without mining down into the material forces that have produced the dominant cultural apparatus and intellectual apparatus, as well as the political theater that we see staged daily in the spectacle of so-called representative democracy. And so in that research, one of the things that I discovered is, and this is of course drawing on a large body of research by other intellectuals as well, is that the national security state of the United States invested enormous resources in making sure that in the post-war era, the New York art scene and the American art scene more generally was seen as an emergent force that could displace Paris as being the center and the kind of capital of cultural production. And that in doing that, there was an enormous amount of investment in works of art that could be mobilized for a sub rosa or clandestine set of operations, in particular the work of the abstract expressionists that's considered to be apolitical, but in fact was mobilized by the funding of the Central Intelligence Agency and other propaganda agencies in order to provide an image of the United States as being a place in which artists were absolutely free to do whatever they wanted and they could express themselves in these exuberant ways, and there's a celebration of the kind of autonomy of the individual artist, when all of that project was actually being driven by the idea of denigrating what was going on in the socialist world, propping up the US not just as an empire that was producing Mickey Mouse and Coca-Cola and bubblegum, but was also producing Jackson Pollock and William Faulkner and Hemingway and all of these other great artists. So the soft power campaign on the part of the empire, the US empire, is unbelievably important for understanding the contemporary world. One way of putting that kind of in a soundbite is that for the US empire to successfully become the global hegemon in the latter half of the 20th century and into the early 21st century, the way that it did that was under the cover of Hollywood and the culture industries. It produced an image of itself that made it look very different than it actually was. And this is what I've referred to in the work that I'm doing with Jennifer Ponce de Leon in a book project that we're working on as the aesthetics of power, the way in which a power apparatus like the US empire has produced an image of itself, and in fact, not just one image, but of course, multiple images of itself, that it has spread around the world in order to confuse people at many different levels of what's going on, right? It's easy to see through Mickey Mouse. It's a little bit more difficult to see through MoMA or to see through decolonial theory or other products that play the role of masking what it is that the US empire is doing.
Sí, es bien interesante. En esa línea, una colega que trabaja con nosotros aquí en la universidad, Fabiana Servidio, posiblemente la conozcas, ha trabajado las circulaciones de artistas latinoamericanos dentro de esta lógica de posguerra que estás mencionando. Y creo que hay una cantidad de indicios que van para este mismo propósito, que en suma lo que está haciendo también es redefinir algo que es un binomio muy recurrente en ciertas líneas de la historiografía artística, como es la relación arte y política, pero que me parece que desde esta perspectiva haciendo una serie de escalones más para complejizar más esta articulación. sea, donde, como estabas comentando, supera la superficie de las imágenes y entra a ver los propósitos y los, voy a decirlo así más brutalmente, los usos del arte en forma muy, muy dirigida, ¿no? En esta línea de pensamiento tú mencionabas la democracia, el concepto de democracia, y me parece que esto inevitablemente resuena en el presente, ¿no? Como construcción, el concepto de democracia norteamericana ha penetrado a la lógica de los intercambios, sobre todo en Occidente, pero también a la lógica de las relaciones internacionales a escala global. Y recientemente los debates sobre preelectorales de los Estados Unidos, creo que, y la situación electoral de las últimas elecciones en Estados Unidos han dejado bastante al descubierto, incluso en la prensa más adicta respecto del sistema norteamericano, digo, han dejado al descubierto la fragilidad y la máscara que supone esta noción de democracia. Tu trabajo de algún modo recorre esa noción y la pone en cuestión. Me interesaría que nos contaras un poco más sobre eso.
Yeah, the first thing that I would say is that you're absolutely right that culture, art, intellectual production, understood in these kind of broad terms, has been a very important weapon in the hands of the ruling class, and that the primary logic that was deployed by the US national security state and other forces, the corporatocracy, the foundation network, and other such things, was to divide the anti-capitalist left from the pro-capitalist, or at least accepting of capitalist left, to drive a wedge between the two, to denigrate the extreme left as beyond the pale and impossible, and to shore up a kind of center-left position. And that campaign, unfortunately, in many circumstances, has been relatively successful, and culture was a big part of that weaponization. In the case of the intelligentsia, of course, they moved a lot of the Western intelligentsia away from anti-capitalist positions and in the direction of basically liberal apologists for the status quo. Even if they're critical of certain elements, you don't have the same resolute anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist positions that you had in the immediate post-war era. In relationship to that, democracy, of course, is the grand ideological value concept that has been deployed by the US in order to produce an image of itself along the lines of what I was saying earlier of the aesthetics of power. And if we want to see through that aesthetics of power, the image that the empire has given to itself, there's a few important things to recognize, right? The United States was not founded as a democracy. It was founded as a republic that was explicitly anti-democratic. It was grounded in a plutocracy and a slaveocracy. The very foundations of US society are it's a settler colony, and its economy was based on slavery in a way that is only comparable to 4 other civilizations in the history of humanity. In that regard, what the US did is it used the term democracy as a kind of PR concept to redefine itself. And this began in the 1830s with the election of Andrew Jackson and kind of took off in the latter half of the 19th century. And it was a process by which the United States began saying that it was a democracy without actually changing the material relations of power and the institutional apparatus that functioned. So here you see the clear juxtaposition between a republic, which is an oligarchy, right? It's the rule of the few, that calls itself a democracy, but develops culture industries that are powerful enough to convince the masses over time that there must be some truth to this claim. And this has been particularly difficult to maintain, given if we come up to the contemporary era, that the United States has overthrown a minimum of some 50 foreign governments since World War II, the majority of which were democratically elected. In addition to, intervening and interfering at least 30 elections, but it's likely more than that, assassinating 30 political leaders internationally and more domestically. And so it's quite difficult to maintain the aesthetics of power when the power of the US empire has been deployed in such extreme and flagrant ways. And so one of the things that I think all of us should be thinking about, interrogating, and investigating is how does this aesthetics of power, how do these culture industries operate to try to keep a lid on what's actually going on? And I couldn't agree more that in the contemporary crisis, given the combination of the economic crisis, the healthcare crisis, the environmental crisis, the political crisis, if people aren't seeing through the veil of the aesthetics of power right now, I don't really know what would be necessary to bring them to enlightenment, because it's so transparent the extent to which the capitalist neoliberal project is absolutely bankrupt in every way, shape, and form.
Sí. Esto a su vez tiene su correlato, digo, esta quiebra del sistema tardocapitalista tiene su correlato en el sistema del arte, que es el que de algún modo nos convoca de una manera muy especial, ¿no? Y creo que el contexto actual lo puso de manifiesto de distintas maneras. O sea, la situación de detención del mundo llevó a mostrar desde fragilidades dentro del sistema del arte, tanto como ciertos vicios, por encontrar un término, que hace que los museos de golpe vean cuestionado su lugar, pero entre otras cosas porque parecería que no tienen cómo sustentarse, y desde condiciones como las nuestras, o sea, realidades como las de Sudamérica, donde los museos trabajan para sus comunidades, con y para sus comunidades, y tienen otras relaciones con el contexto. Llama mucho la atención que grandes museos hoy vean totalmente en vilo o en crisis su continuidad o su existencia, porque se ha suspendido el turismo o la circulación de lo que es la recaudación económica, ¿no? Como la lógica tardocapitalista llegó a retirarse a los estados del sostén de la cultura y a replantear la relación de otra manera, con lo cual el avance de los privados también ha tenido una presencia muy grande en términos de condicionamiento también de esta producción. Digo, me parece que estas otras lógicas también están mostrando, creo que esta situación actual muestra debilidades de este sistema. Ahora, llegados hasta aquí, ¿cómo imaginas una resolución crítica de este conflicto?
It's the $1 million question, right? Except for you're not paid to answer it. That's the catch. So I would say, to begin with, I couldn't agree more with a lot of what you've just said. And one way of conceptualizing that is that, on the one hand, I'm very critical of, and I think we need an analysis of, what I was calling the aesthetics of power. At the same time, I'm very interested in the power of aesthetics. And there are two tactics that I'll just highlight in that regard. And this is speaking less specifically about curatorial or museum practices than the work of artists. So we can cycle back to this if you would like. But the power of aesthetics, I would say that there are at least two aspects that can be identified. And that is that artists and cultural producers and intellectuals can, on the one hand, provide us with a way of apprehending and perceiving the ways in which this spectacle culture or the aesthetics of power operates. A great example of that would be Alfredo Jar's work on the Rwandan genocide, when he juxtaposed the cover of, I believe it was Time or Newsweek magazine, that was talking about trifles and superficial issues, to what was actually going on in history. And so he'd provide subtitles of what was going on in the Rwandan genocide, while the spectacle of Time and Newsweek was distracting the general population by talking about, meaningless things, basically, and how it took months and months and months before finally the propaganda apparatus from the US had to admit that the Rwandan genocide was going on and kind of bring it to the fore. And so Jar's project in that regard, I think, is a good example of how the power of aesthetics can operate to foreground the spectacle that invisibilizes various forms of political violence around the world. But a second example of that I think is really interesting. So aesthetics can do that, but it can also function in order to operate as the kind of channel or a portal into a different world or another world. Meaning that it's not only diagnostic, right, in describing how the spectacle is constructed and allowing us to see through it, but the power of aesthetics can also be that of channeling, producing, and putting forth a world that is in conflict with the dominant ideological world. And so a reference that comes to mind is the work of Eduardo Galeano in a book like Upside Down, in which he puts forth what he calls the counter school, right? And he demonstrates how there are all of these ideological features of the contemporary world, but he simultaneously channels a different world, meaning a different way of organizing social relations that wouldn't be based on the maximization of profit, but instead putting people first, putting nature first, putting social relations first, and constructing a world that is already being made, for that matter. Raoul Zabecki's work comes to mind in this regard as well. It's not like a world beyond capitalism is just something that can be projected into the future. It's a struggle that's currently going on in the contemporary moment. And certain artists and writers like Galeano have really brought to the fore that world and used their art form as a kind of way of channeling it into the dominant world so that we can see it and tap into it.
Sí, el arte tiene esa capacidad de prefigurar aspectos de la realidad y ayudarnos a pensarla. Me quedé con tu planteo de la etapa de Times y los ocultamientos o la superposición de información que negaba lo que ocurría en Ruanda, en relación con otro aspecto que trabajás, que es el de, o sea, en estos términos que pones en cuestión. Uno es el de la tecnología, y aparecería la tecnología ligada a la información como un instrumento que gobierna y orienta los modos de titular o de construir las narrativas del día a día de los periódicos, en términos de mercado, de posicionamiento en los buscadores, etc. Los periodistas hoy día dicen que tienen que, de hecho hubo una renuncia muy sonada en Estados Unidos de uno de sus editorialistas porque se negaba a trasvestir sus textos en relación a las demandas, a las prefiguraciones que salía por los algoritmos, ¿no? Según lo que cada día había que incluir en el título para aparecer en el ranking. Entonces, ¿cómo imaginar contravenir esa lógica desde la misma lógica? Porque en realidad creo que la mejor manera de trabajar frente a algo es conocerlo bien y encontrarle la fisura. O no, bueno, no sé, es una perspectiva, puede haber muchas más.
I absolutely agree that technology needs to be understood, the history of the development of technology in the broad sense of the term, right? Not just digital technologies, but going back to writing as a technology for that matter. They need to be understood as embedded within a social totality in which there are forces that are constructing those technologies, that are privileging certain ones and not other ones, and that the contemporary world is definitely unbelievably marked by what people call the kind of fourth industrial revolution, or the kind of digital revolution of the contemporary era. And that in relationship to that, I guess I would say two things. On the one hand, I think it's really important to try to understand better how those technologies operate. And there's been a dominant ideology that consists in saying that, well, technology has now liberated all of us because we're our own cultural producers, we're our own, curators, and everybody has their Facebook or Twitter or Instagram account and other such things. And that's not exactly what has happened, right? The golden age of technological future that was put forth in the early 21st century has turned into a kind of dystopian nightmare of sorts, in which the technologies have, on the one hand, been very controlled by the military-industrial complex, by the corporatocracy, by the control over algorithms, by the control over who has access to internet, by the control of what speeds of internet one has access to. So this is really a very important site of power and control. And the more that we can understand how it functions, I think the more we can push back against the naive assumptions, but then also find, and this is the second part of what I wanted to say, sites of intervention in which you can recognize that the world has been remade with the emergence of digital technologies. But in that remaking, even if a lot of it is controlled by the most powerful elements in contemporary society, there are opportunities to intervene quite forcefully to use those technologies against themselves, to channel alternative worlds, as I said earlier, as well as to produce artistic projects that kind of challenge the ways in which technologies are understood. The work of Wafa Bilal comes to mind. If you remember, this is a project that's a bit dated, but it's an interesting manifestation of that, the Shoot an Iraqi piece that he did, in which he connected a paint gun to a computer and allowed anybody around the world to log on and shoot the paint gun at him, an Iraqi, in a room who was trying to dodge the paint gun. And it's a really interesting critical commentary on the kind of role of technology in contemporary warfare, particularly in the case of Iraq, but then also on the ways in which the anonymity of the interface in technology would allow people to be, you know, very pleased to log on and shoot somebody who's halfway around the world. And he really foregrounded both the political elements, but also the geographic elements of technology, right? Because if you've seen the Brazilian film Bacurau is a great example of this, how there's a technological space that has been constructed that is an alternative space to just geography in the kind of physical sense of the term, and that the people who own the digital space are those who own everything. It's the ruling class, the transnational capitalist class. But at the same time, there are ways of struggling against that. And art, I think, is a great example of that. Bacurau, I could talk more about because I think it's a fascinating filmic example of that.
No, a mí me interesa cerrar un poco, cómo volvés con este tema a la pregunta por la estética, ¿no? Y la relación entre estética y política es algo que has trabajado mucho. Y estamos pensando en la construcción de los relatos, ¿no? Y justamente dentro de las lógicas de dominación imperialista, yo pensaría mucho en cómo se construyen sociedades delibidinizadas, ¿no? Donde realmente se gobierna por la angustia, entre la angustia desde no tener que comer, la angustia de trabajar 14 horas por día, y el arte en relación con eso tiene esa capacidad para mí fundamental de dos cuestiones, que serían una, la construcción de afirmación vital, ¿no? Como recuperación de cierto goce y placer que por sí tiene una potencia subversiva contra esos relatos dominantes. Y dos, y aquí me interesa mucho preguntarte a vos, para mí también la construcción de una historicidad para esos relatos que son los que nos producen la angustia, ¿no? Porque muchísimas veces justamente lo que hacen estos medios, lo que hace la revista Time, lo que construye el aparato global es, por ejemplo, los relatos fascistas, ¿no? Donde culpar a uno de la angustia, culpar de la angustia propia a el otro que viene a sacar el trabajo, el otro que viene con sus demandas a pedir un espacio en la esfera pública, y justamente el arte construye una historicidad diferente, construye visibilidad, hace esto que venís resaltando mucho en tu diálogo, que es decir, ver a través. Entonces te pregunto un poco qué pensás de esto y qué es ese ver a través de para vos.
Well, maybe I take a very specific example, and that is the concept and practice of art as it's been consolidated within the European tradition and what people call the bourgeois concept and practice of art, right? The idea that what art ultimately is, and I'm going to be very fast on this, but just the broad parameters, and this is drawing on the work of Ticio Escobar and others, that art is about producing an object creatively or a practice or a happening that can then be exhibited and monetized in various ways, and it's produced by an individual who has intellectual property rights over what's produced, etc. And the reason I point to this is because what that does is it actually forecloses this broader understanding of aesthetics that Leandro was alluding to, right? That if we understand aesthetics, not just in terms of the bourgeois concept and practice of art, that is it's a colonial project, right? This has been expanded around the world, emanating out from Europe. Then we can see aesthetics is understood, if it's understood more broadly, is about the ways in which we compose a world of sense, meaning a world of sensory perception and sensory apprehension, but also a world that makes sense intellectually and mentally. And aesthetics in this much broader understanding of the term means that practices that existed prior to the emergence of the modern concept and practice of art and that are simultaneous to it can actually be recognized as sources of creative labor power that are figuring a world, that are producing a common world. In this regard, another way of putting this is that for me, the starting point should not be, hey, there's this thing called art over here that is the bourgeois concept and practice of art, and politics over here, how do they relate? But instead, we should begin by recognizing that aesthetics is how Homo sapiens as creative makers compose a world of sense and a world that makes sense, right? And so then coming to the latter part of Leandro's question, one of the attempts on the part of what I was calling the aesthetics of power, right? Or we could understand just more generally as ideology in this materialist aesthetic sense, is to compose a world that makes sense for the ruling class and quote unquote make sense, meaning it constructs a narrative that can be accepted by at least large segments of the population that are subjected to the power of the ruling class. And so part of the aesthetic struggle, I think, needs to be recognizing that there's a world of sense making that is imposed by the PR, propaganda, cultural apparatus. And that world only makes sense to 0.001% of the population. To the majority of the population, it does not make sense. It's an irrational project that is decimating the conditions of possibility of human existence. And so part of the role of aesthetics needs to be composing an alternative world that really makes sense for collectivities and for the masses of humanity. And part of that has to be a project of narratology, right? How we tell these stories, how we construct narratives that are meaningful to the masses of humanity. And there's, of course, many very good examples of that. And I could dive deeper into this in the question of fascism, but I'll stop there and let you come back at me with other questions or comments.
Sigamos con eso porque nos interesa, porque además es interesante cómo, yendo al punto de lo que acabas de comentar, cómo se activó recientemente la noción de fascismo. El fascismo, todos sabemos que está asociado a un periodo histórico, a una serie de procesos, o sea, es una noción que nace además asociada a un movimiento específico. Sin embargo, esta noción se extendió y aparece denominando cosas bien diversas. Eso es lo más curioso o problemático, mejor dicho, ¿no? Hoy día el fascismo puede terminar adjetivando actitudes que podríamos entender literalmente como fascistas, pensando en lo que representó el fascismo histórico, pero también se adscribe hoy día la noción de fascismo a otras formas que están bastante alejadas de lo que podría ser el fascismo, o que pueden estar asociadas a autoritarismos, o a veces ni siquiera eso, y sin embargo hay como un travestismo de las nociones en la apropiación contemporánea. Entonces, por eso nos interesaría, si quieres, seguir por allí.
Yeah, I would say that it's very helpful to compare and contrast the ways in which terms like democracy and fascism operate in the dominant historical and political imaginary, particularly the ways in which it's emanated out of the United States and it's formatted its narratives regarding the world. Because what we learn, in short, is that democracy is 2,500 years old, was invented in ancient Greece, and has been on a progress narrative ever since, or it's been progressively developing ever since, and the United States has been helping spread it around the world. But fascism, oddly enough, according to the dominant narrative, only occurred once in time in one place in Western Europe, Germany and Italy. And then US democracy intervened in order to defeat it, right? So the quote unquote positive aspects of the US empire are generalized and made into this trans-historical narrative of progress, which is fundamentally false at every level. And at the same time, the negative aspects of the contemporary capitalist world, such as fascism, are rendered absolutely exceptional. It's what I refer to as the ideology of fascist exceptionalism. And in relationship to that, I think it's interesting that what happened in the interwar period in Europe mirrored what was going on in the United States. The United States was recognized by the Nazis as the best model of a racial police state. And they studied what was going on in the United States, particularly with the treatment of the African Americans and the indigenous population, as a real model for the legal apparatus that was set up in Nazi Germany, as well as the fact that the colonial endeavor, of which, you know, the United States is just a colony, but it was the westward expansion of colonialism in the United States that was taken as the model for the eastward expansion of the Nazi war machine marching against the Bolsheviks, right? And so in all of those ways, there's actually the exceptional fascism in the European case was largely modeled on the US. It was funded by the global corporatocracy. Ford, GM, DuPont, they all profited enormously from the Second World War. And then in the wake of World War II, the national security state redeployed many of the very top leading figures within the fascist regime in Italy and the Nazi regime in the development of what is a veritable fascist international. When you count the numbers, we're talking about tens of thousands of fascists and Nazis who are high-ranking officials who were brought to the United States, who were allowed to move through rat lines to Latin America and elsewhere in the world, and who were set back up in stay-behind armies in Europe itself. In that regard, just coming full circle, this is an excellent example of what I refer to as the aesthetics of power. Right? If the United States has been, and I think it's so well documented, it would be ignorant to deny this, what MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., called the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, given its imperial endeavors, then how is it that it's gotten away with all of that? And a big part of the answer to that is the mobilization of unbelievably powerful culture industries that provide cover for the fascist international. And that relationship between the kind of clandestine fascist organizations that have been organized around the world, Operation Condor, of course, in Latin America would be a great example of this, and there are many, many others, was constantly, there was an attempt at least, many people see through this, but an attempt to provide cover through the culture industries, as well as through liberal hegemonic rule, or rule by consensus, right? So that when you have a Joe Biden or an Obama or a Kennedy who oversees the empire, all of a sudden people have trouble seeing what's actually going on in their foreign policy, right? So hopefully that connects some of the issues that we're talking about, but I'm curious if you have more questions or comments.
No, creo que lo que Diana estaba como señalando sobre todo es dentro de esta continuidad histórica que vos ves del fascismo y las migraciones, ¿no? Incluso de lo que fue el escape de los jerarcas hacia el continente americano en un momento, ¿por qué en los últimos años tenemos un surgimiento del fascismo como noción en la esfera pública y de gobiernos que son más abiertamente reaccionarios, más abiertamente discriminatorios, ¿no? ¿Cómo es que emergen esos discursos y qué clase de, cómo escribir esto en ese proceso histórico?
Incluso muchas veces estos discursos fascistas emergen con la idea de que son los líderes de la libertad o de la neutralidad ideológica frente a las izquierdas que, o sea, a ver, para dar un caso totalmente banal, pero que al que estamos asistiendo, por lo menos en la prensa local, se habla de la vacuna rusa como si nos fueran a inocular el comunismo, y perdón, ¿dónde está la Unión Soviética? En ese sentido, ¿no? ¿Cómo podemos llegar a estas situaciones caricaturescas por la manera en que se van manipulando las ideas y los conceptos?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would say that in the historical model that was developed in Italy and Germany, a large part of the fascist project was identifying the symptoms of a particular disease, which was primarily the crisis of global capitalism at that point in time. Every capitalist state in Europe in the wake of the Great Depression had fascist movements. But in identifying the symptoms, they didn't go to the root causes, right? And instead, there was a process of scapegoating by which it was the fault of immigrants, of Jews, of other racialized minorities, of queer people, of communists, etc. And all of that scapegoating was an opportunity on the part of the fascists to use the propaganda apparatus, right? Because if you didn't have the radio, and then later TV, like these are very powerful technologies for mobilizing the masses around a particular project of scapegoating racialized minorities, and sometimes they're racialized majorities for that matter, in order to get the civil society on board with a fascist project of what amounts to basically increased capitalist accumulation, right? Because we have to recognize that fascism historically is a false revolution, right? They try to dress in the garb of the Bolsheviks or others, but ultimately that is only pure symbol, and their fundamental project is pro-capitalist, white supremacist, and Christian, right? And that, all three of those, of course, map on perfectly to the United States and the colonial white supremacist project of the United States. Regarding, because there was a lot that you packed into your questions, but regarding the issue of the contemporary crisis and the rise of, or the resurgence of various forms of authoritarianism and fascism around the world, I think it's important to recognize that the neoliberal project that dates from the 1970s was about globalizing production chains and dismantling the social welfare state that had dominated from about the 30s to the 70s, and privatizing everything under the sun, as well as the digitalization and financialization of the economy. So it's a global restructuring of capitalism in order to maximize profits at the expense of people and the environment. And that project, when it was first introduced, also segued with the dismantling of the Soviet Union, right? And so the fact that the Soviet Union was dismantled also allowed for neoliberalism to inject steroids into its project, because it no longer had to say, oh, well, there's full employment, healthcare for all, and housing for all in the Soviet Union. You don't have to worry about that as getting flack, right? The capitalist states could just pursue the neoliberal project and inject steroids into it. And that part of what we're seeing unfold right now is that the hegemonic rule, and by that, of course, I just mean, as in the work of Antonio Gramsci, rule by consensus. You convince people that this democratico-technological civilizing mission is the best thing possible. In order to do that, you need to provide a material basis for consensus. So if you have a broad middle class, as you had in the United States in the 50s and 60s, it's pretty easy to, or it was at least, to convince people that killing people elsewhere in the world is fine and that they can be on board with consensual rule. But when you take away the material basis for survival by withering away the welfare state and injecting steroids into the neoliberal project, you lose the material basis for consensus. And so the ruling class internationally has a crisis of unprecedented sort on its hands that's at least twofold. One is there's a withering away of consensus under the rule of representative democracy, so-called. People are seeing through it because they can't get food. They can't get a job or hold a job. They can't get a house. They can't get healthcare. Obviously, in this particular instance, that's flagrant. But in response to that, one of the possible solutions that mirrors what went on in the early 20th century is that transnational capitalist class goes fascist and authoritarian, because you don't need consensual rule if you can rule with an iron fist. And so that resurgence, I think, needs to be contextualized in this particular context. And there are battles in the transnational capitalist class between how best to rule the masses of humanity, right? Should we do it through consensus? Can we do it through consensus? In the case of the Biden election, we have the appearance of that, you know, as opposed to the Trump option. But elsewhere in the world, obviously there's a greater turn towards authoritarian and fascist forms of rule.
Sí, creo que además la pandemia tendió a, por un lado, a reducir la legitimidad de muchos regímenes y por otro, a debilitar las democracias construidas por consenso y a habilitar estos nuevos autoritarismos, ¿no?
It's interesting because you have to look, of course, in individual cases and how it's playing out at the level of the nation state. But one fascinating thing to do is to just look at the global map of the pandemic currently. And the places that are in the hot red are the Western capitalist countries, primarily the United States and Western Europe, but also Eastern Europe to a certain extent. And what's interesting about that is we have to understand this historically. And that is that the dismantling of the social welfare state, the demolition of the socialist bloc, and the opening up of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union to massive forms of capitalist accumulation have developed on the back of destroying a healthcare system that would provide healthcare as a basic human right to all human beings. And so in that context, what we're living through is the consequences of the neoliberal evisceration of healthcare as a human right. And it's not at all surprising in that regard that then the reaction of a lot of these states is to put the onus on the general population or on individuals. And so in the case of the United States, which unfortunately I know better than most others because I'm currently living here, you have a situation where it's very hard to get tested. It's very hard to get results quickly. The hospitals are overflowing. There is very limited access by poor and racialized communities to reliable healthcare, and that people are just expected to social distance and wear masks. And as if that's going to solve the problem. There's not contact tracing. There's not any serious attempt to address these problems. Whereas when you look at what's happened in China, Cuba, Vietnam, other parts of the world, it's been more or less eradicated. And so if we in the US put the resources that we put into the military, into the healthcare system, there would not be a pandemic in the United States today. But the ruling class refuses to do that.
Es bastante desalentador todo esto que estamos viviendo y no podemos no llegar a como un momento de suspensión y de falta de aliento en este tipo de intercambios. Lo que nos queda siempre desde las posiciones que elegimos es, por un lado, seguir ejerciendo el sentido crítico y por el otro, seguir trabajando en estos espacios en donde creemos que es posible dar visibilidad a estas cuestiones, ¿no? O sea, desde la teoría crítica, desde las acciones estéticas, artísticas, eso de algún modo creo que es lo que nos mueve a los que estamos aquí y a seguir trabajando en el estímulo y en el desarrollo de estos procesos. Cuando comentabas acerca de las necesidades de revisar las lógicas y justamente como comentaba Leandro, el poder pensar las narrativas, el poder pensar el canon, hay algo que para nosotros desde BIENALSUR forma parte desde el comienzo de nuestros propósitos, que es poder incluir en nuestro proyecto todas las instancias que sean posibles para habilitar justamente a estos choques de sentido, a estos insights acerca de estas lógicas que se manejan con inercia, que pueden ser desde las lógicas de los circuitos artísticos, de las jerarquías, de las distancias entre grandes instituciones o entre centros y periferias, y revisar todas estas situaciones desde el propio gesto de poner todo a la par, de intentar ensayos horizontales, de desmarcar incluso las instituciones y hablar por kilómetros que son absolutamente arbitrarios, pero tan arbitrarios como cualquier otro sistema, porque en realidad todo es una construcción, ¿no? Y desde ahí me parece que intentamos contribuir a, por lo menos, desactivar estas lógicas que aparecen cada vez más estructuradas y estructurantes de la realidad, que eso quizás es lo más preocupante, ¿no? Como si cuando empezó esta pandemia muchos creímos, no sé, voy a poner a alguien a quien valoro mucho como Zizek, digo, muchos creímos con Zizek que esto era el principio del fin de todo este sistema como para alumbrar una nueva perspectiva. Creo que a 9 meses o 10 meses de que empezó todo esto, no tengo muy claro qué está diciendo Zizek ahora, pero yo tengo la sensación de que hay que seguir trabajando en el mismo sentido para ver si encontramos el principio del fin.
There's a lot in what you said. I would add that the moment that we're living in is actually also, to kind of foreground the positive aspects of it, it's exciting in certain ways because the coronavirus crisis is a crisis of global capitalism, and it is the result of, like, the current economic crisis is also due to the fact that the 2008-2009 meltdown was never really, like, that crisis was never fully repaired. And so in that regard, we're seeing coronavirus picking up on elements that were already operative. And I think that it's an opportunity for a lot of people to see through the aesthetics of power, right? Because when the material basis is withered away, when your loved ones are sick and can't get health care, it's much easier to unplug from the TV set and to recognize that something's up and that you better get plugged into a larger world. The second thing is that in the case of the United States, it's quite fascinating because socialism is on the rise in the United States. And I grew up in the Cold War era when socialism was a bad word and communism is even worse and anarchism even worse. And so it's an exciting moment to see particularly the youth and the disenfranchised proletarian working class within the United States to be developing socialist power at this point in time, and not just the Democratic Socialists of America, which are much more reformist and problematic in certain regards, but to the left of that, so more kind of revolutionary socialist traditions. But speaking more pointedly to what you highlighted, I think that aesthetics can play a really essential role, and does play a fundamental role, in figuring alternative communities, modes of social relations, and also transforming the perceptual matrix of the dominant ideology so that we can see through the spectacle and perceive other ways of living, as well as politically educate people through communal practices. I'm thinking a little bit about one of the earlier questions that Leandro asked, because aesthetics is also not just about individuals producing things that are exhibited, it's about communities forging a world of sense that makes sense for them, but that also functions to politically educate those people who are involved in that community. And the last thing that I would say is I'd make a plug for the great book by Jennifer Ponce de Leon that's coming out in the spring entitled Another Aesthetics is Possible, in which she looks specifically at artistic communities, some of which are in Argentina, that are figuring a world that is different than the world imposed by the spectacle of global capitalism. I was saying that one of the reasons that aesthetics is so important is because it can figure an alternative world in all of its dimensions. It can make us perceive alternative worlds, think, feel, desire, be attracted to, and that kind of multidimensional force of aesthetics is really essential to channeling alternative worlds, but then also constructing communities that build those worlds, right? And here I was thinking about Leandro's earlier question concerning aesthetic communities, and Leandro and I have also talked about indigenous art practices and other such things. And certain forms of aesthetics can really be mobilized to make a community of people who share a common sense of the world and can produce and expand that world that makes sense, that functions really as a way of building power slowly but surely against the forces of transnational capital that are destroying the conditions of possibility of life. And the last thing that I would add, and this is maybe just to give some specific examples to this, is that Jennifer Ponce de Leon, with whom I'm collaborating on with for a book, has a book that's coming out in the spring that looks at a lot of artistic communities, some of which are in Argentina and elsewhere in Latin America, that is entitled Another Aesthetics is Possible. And a fascinating aspect of this book is really mining down into how aesthetic communities can figure different worlds, and not just figure them as utopian or otherworldly or an imaginary world, but actually begin to make them through communal interactions, through social movements, through alternative artistic and cultural sites and other such things.
Sí, sí, creo que tu último comentario nos deja, nosotros en general nos cuesta cerrar porque por una cuestión ideológica, porque ninguna conversación se cierra, porque ninguna puerta ni ninguna cabeza se cierra, sino que este tipo de conversaciones disparan muchas cosas más, nos dejan pensando. Así que te agradecemos y quedamos abiertos a seguir charlando en algún otro momento y seguir pensando juntos. Muchísimas gracias, Gabriel, por este tiempo, por estas ideas, por este intercambio, por tu generosidad.
Thank you for having me on, and I certainly hope that we'll continue the conversations and find ways of building another world through aesthetics and ideas and other such things.